Hi, it's John English with Cyril Donahue, and this man is a walking encyclopedia of the information involving the Irish history on the river, and also for Nelson. And we're going to have a little look-see here in the Friends of Beaubears site, just across the school from Nelson Rural High, junior high right now, but I think it's called Nelson Rural. But anyway, we're going to go and take a look-see about what's around, and he's got a great depth of knowledge and goes back a long way and was involved in Friends of Beaubears for almost from the beginning, if not the beginning, and we're going to find out what he knows. So take it away, Cyril.
Okay, thank you, John. My interest is local history. I'm interested in history of New Brunswick, but I'm really interested in history of Miramichi. And I've been kind of a collector of books and material on Miramichi history for quite some time. Often I might have 2 or 3 or 4 copies of a book, but then I'll find somebody that's just looking for that book and can't find it, and I'll say, well, here it is. Might be Father Monsignor Hickey's Scarlet Dawn or whatever. So Nelson is a wonderful spot to me because I spent 27 years here as principal of the school across the road. Started out as Nelson Intermediate and eventually became Nelson Rural School. We just took the high out, and instead of being Nelson Rural High School, it was Nelson Rural School. Nice K-8 school, the envy of many people
Got a great
that
reputation.
I taught with across the province.
Quality.
And this park here is Bicentennial Park. Bicentennial because New Brunswick became a province in 1784, and so in 1984, when the province was doing bicentennial activities, one of the things that the village of Nelson at the time decided to, this was a property they owned, to turn this into a park. So it became a park really in 1984. Some people may have doubted it because it was basically a sawdust pile, but and the ground is still spongy, but it's nice. And so Friends of Beaubears Island eventually came here in the late 1980s or early 1990s and started Friends of Beaubears Island Interpretive Center. So initially, before there was even a building, we did our summer programs in the foyer of Nelson Rural School, and we had students like probably Sean McCarthy and some others who were interested and had lots of information on the area.
Was that during the summer or during the school year?
It was during the summer.
Okay.
So we did that during the summer. And then we started out with a smaller building and eventually added on because across the road here there's a sign that says Miramichi Landings. In the mid-90s, I would say, or late 90s, the city of Miramichi had 13 sites, I believe it was, city property, where they were going to do improvements and make a whole kind of a history tour of the river. So we were fortunate that Bicentennial Park and Friends of Beaubears Island were part of the initial group, and a lot of the money for the extension of this building and the interpretive panels and that sort of thing inside came from Miramichi Landings, which Miramichi Landings other sites would have been Middle Island, Beaverbrook House, I believe. I'm not sure if the enclosure was, probably not, because the enclosure is not in the city. Anyway, there were 13 sites, I'm sure. So, as you're around here, there's a kiosk here with different interpretive panels in it. I can see right here Joseph Russell, and Joseph Russell was done by Joyce. I'm trying to think what Joyce's last name was. Joyce did that panel. The Nelson Village, I was lucky enough to be able to do that one. And basically it's a streetscape of the front street here. And it has some of the stores that would have been along the shoreline here, plus some pictures of some students in the Monaghan School, which would have been up by St. Patrick's Church, and maybe even the White School, or Nelson Intermediate, Nelson Elementary, which everybody just refers to as the White School. I remember one thing in particular when Parks Canada were doing one of the panels, and I was kind of proofreading it for them, and they mentioned the Scottish and the English and the French, and I said, well, how come you didn't mention the Irish? And the gentleman at Parks Canada said, because we have no information on the Irish being part of the island. I said, well, give me 20 minutes. So I went to the 1851 census, a binder I have, which was given to me by Earl English, John's father, and I copied the page out on John Harley, and where it shows he's from Ireland, and I sent that off to the guy at Parks Canada. He emailed me back, the Irish will be included. So the Irish are mentioned there in one of those panels. So those panels are kind of interesting. Out here there's also a monument for the war veterans. This used to be, the basis of it originally was up at the village hall.
Up by the old fire hall.
Up by the fire hall. And when the village just became part of the city, then they kind of started it down here. And there's nice events here. This is, when I in Remembrance Day, this is where I always come to. And because each of the little bricks on top, they were paid for or whatever with people's names, and one of the names is Warren Casey, and he's my wife's father, who was in the Second World War. So across the river, of course, from here, this is a perfect site, because then we have Beaubears Island, and Beaubears Island, the first people you hear tell of in relation to Beaubears Island and Wilson's Point would be Nicholas and Richard Denis. But then along comes William Davison, 1776, I believe, was the year.
Yeah, right around there.
Around that time, was given a grant of 100,000 acres, which basically started right at this location and went up both sides of the river.
Big land.
And included Beaubears Island and Wilson's Point. Wilson's Point, if I backtrack a little bit, before it, the Scottish came here with William Davison, it was probably the site of the Acadians. And during the time of the Acadian expulsion, they came up the river, some of them came up the river to here, and had their encampment probably at Wilson's Point. Now there's debate whether it was here on this side of the river, the other side of the river, or at Wilson's Point, but probably at Wilson's Point. And now there's a monument there to the Acadians.
And before that would have been likely a meeting place for the First Nations.
Oh, yeah, definitely for the First Nations. Before that, I mean,
for a long time.
This was just a natural spot for the First Nations, because it was at the confluence of the Southwest and Northwest, and so no matter where you were coming from, that was the meeting point. Right?
Imagine the fishery that was to be had back then. It would have been just outstanding with bass and gaspereau, shad, salmon. It would have been just mind-boggling to what you see today.
And William Davison was given the land more to settle the land, and supposed to clear so many acres, he and John Court, but the fishery was so good that they were involved heavily in the fishery and shipping it off either to the Caribbean or back to England, or I believe some of their ships, like the Lowell was one of their first ships, sunk off the coast of Spain, maybe, if I'm recalling my facts. But then, of course, the timber trade became big, because it was the time of the wooden sailing ships, and a lot of the sailing ships, there were a lot of them built here on the river, at least 500. After William Davison, and he built, I think it was 3 ships, maybe, or maybe more, but one of them was the Lowell, another was the Lovett, I believe.
Louise Manning has a great book on the ships that were built on here and where the actual sites were for the shipbuilding itself. A tremendous book, and probably at a print, but you can find that at the local library. Wonderful book.
And in the back of that book, there's a map, a fold-out map, which
Yes,
shows all along the
yes.
river and where the sites and
Incredible.
the locations are. And she has all the ships listed as well. Now, she herself admits that maybe there's a few missing, but she has an awful lot of them listed, and what type of ship they were, and what the tonnage was, and how much they were valued at by Lloyd's of London, and that sort of thing.
Even who the main builder was.
Yes.
Incredible book.
And I know inside the interpretive center here, it talks about Joseph Russell and John Harley. Joseph Russell, very interesting guy, in that he owned the island in the 1830s. Originally he was at Inglis Hollow in Chatham, but it was just during that time that the Mormons were starting to go out and I won't say recruit people, but let people be known about the Mormon way. And Joseph Russell became converted to the Mormon faith. And he was in Chatham and was really ostracized in Chatham. I mean, given a hard time. And so the island here became for sale, and he bought the island and moved his shipbuilding business up to here. Eventually, it's a long story, but eventually he went to Salt Lake City and became a big time person within the Mormon faith and the Mormon church. And on the island still, there's a small enclosure which has some of his children that are buried there. And the story is, whether it's true or not, that some of them had been buried in Chatham, but he exhumed them and reburied them on the island. And that small little piece of ground, to my understanding, still belongs to the Mormons.
Maybe so.
You know, I mean, I know that during
Didn't know that.
over years, that we had some of the people of the Mormon faith come over here, and some of the leaders as well. Yeah.
Beautiful sandstone, like
Yeah.
blocks. And I'll ask you this question here. This tree here, memory of Earl English. Why Earl? Why him? When at the time there would have been Vince McCarthy, which is an outstanding, or Al O'Neill, or why there and why him?
Well, because one of the reasons I would say is because this book, Nelson Has Neighbors, which was a lot of research, took a lot of years, is Earl's book. And Earl was passionate about the history of Nelson and its neighbors, and one of its neighbors being Burnaby River. And so I'm sure that tree was placed there in his memory.
Okay.
As it should be.
Well, he loved his community, and he loved the people in the community. Firm supporter of the village, and of course he was alive when we became a city in '95, and that was, that was that. We had great ball fields, we had great volunteer fire department, and it was a good time. It was a good time to be Nelson.
And you mentioned Vince McCarthy. Vince McCarthy probably should have a tree too.
Yes,
but
absolutely.
Vince, I think the seniors' place up on Cody Street, is that name not named Vince McCarthy?
I always knew it as a little white school.
No, I mean the seniors' apartments that are in
okay,
Cody
okay,
Street.
the residential. Yeah.
I
Oh,
think.
you might be right.
And
Yeah, I don't know
of
for
course,
sure.
Vince is a pretty modest man. I mean, he would say yes, but that means name it after Earl, not me.
Dirty bugger.
Yeah. So.
He was a great leader, and Alan Neal did this fantastic thing, and I went through the Boy Scouts with him, and the volunteer fire department were, just a bunch of local boys, but when the bell rang, siren went out, they went up there, and they fought fires in for people's homes, and softball association was just booming, just incredible, and it was a lovely time to be a member of this community. It was great, actually.
I was a Boy Scout in Newcastle, and in Newcastle, our leader was Alan Vickers, who was from Nowlanville, one of the Vickers from Nowlanville, and was big into the co-op at the time. He died young, but he was our scoutmaster, and sometimes we would go to a combined camp where Earl was, not Earl, Al O'Neill was there, and we would be there as well. But yeah, Al was was quite the man, for sure.
year after year. And
Yeah.
actually, when my dad was in park looking after tours and parks here, every year we'd go over there and there'd be a section of the park that would be used for Boy Scout camps.
Mm-hmm.
And before that was a place up above Red Bank called Dennis's.
Right, I've been to Genesis. Yeah. And the other thing, I mean, maybe I don't know if you know or not, but there was one family that had all these attractive girls that we were happy to go see as well.
Holy jumpers! Okay then. So yeah, we had the volunteers were the reason why this community in Nelson Miramichi was so outstanding, and so many different levels. And Birchall's was running most of the time. Katie was running, so we had good employment here, and people lived here. They spent their money here. They earned their money here. They had churches here, and they wanted to build up even outside rink up there by the old fire hall. I was on that many times, and certainly it had to be put together by volunteers.
My father was from Barneyville River, and my father worked for at least 35 years for J. Leonard O'Brien as a scaler, and he was a dedicated Leonard O'Brien man. Like, when he scaled a load of wood, it was accurate. Like, even the truckers didn't complain because they knew that James did an honest scale, right?
Level on the level.
Level on the level. And so his scaling stick, his extension hold, is in the interpretive center here. I figured this is a good spot for it.
So he would have measured. Well, he would have measured essentially logs going into Brian's.
Into O'Brien's, but mostly what I would call pit props. We would call them pit props or whatever, because a lot of them were shipped off.
Yes.
To Europe, right?
Yeah.
Basically
right.
shipped off to Europe. Really, he was there before it was a pulp mill. Well, Fraser's in Newcastle started in the early 50s, but over this side of the river it started later on.
64, 65.
Yeah, so that was just about the time my father was retiring.
Wondering how they scale it, whether it was, like you would a cord of wood, or it was in individual pieces.
It was cord of wood.
Okay.
Yeah. And so, the scaling shed was, as you, I know that there were some people who grew up here that used to tell me they used to go to the scaling shed and sit there with my father, like Eric Cameron, you might know.
Well, it was his position of trust and authority, a scaler, and what he did, depending on, the guy that brought in the wood, that was how he was paid according to that scale.
Yeah.
So it was very important.
Yeah, and the truckers knew that if they were broken down in the woods, and that was often, they would stop by our place in Newcastle at 10 o'clock at night. My father would still scale the load, because then at least he'd come over and unload it and hit the road early in the morning. Otherwise,
right?
He'd be stuck losing half a day the next day or something, right?
Well, a lot of them were had woodlots back in Barnaby, north of Newcastle, and Nellyville for that matter. A lot of woodlots brought out their wood, and they cut it by hand themselves, or with a crosscut early, but then it became chainsaw, and that's where they made their bread and butter. If they happened to be part-time farmers and part-time woods workers, that wasn't uncommon for